Bill Veeck was born on February 9th, 1914, and, as a direct result, 37 years later, a little person that stood 3 feet 7 inches tall was taking an official Major League at-bat against the Detroit Tigers. A lot of insane things happened in between those events, and many others followed it. We're here to tell you about the most entertaining ones. Canada is on fire and trying to kill you. Might as well hide inside and watch some tube. And lucky for you, the Dugs have uploaded a new video. Welcome back to the Dugs, where everything we do is an excuse to tell a lot of baseball stories and a lot of jokes. Bill Veeck's impact on baseball can still be seen everywhere today. To hear him tell it, he's the reason why there's ivy at Wrigley Field. He came up with the idea one day in 1937 and snuck out in the middle of the night to covertly make it happen, according to his autobiography, a fact that is definitely not directly contradicted by this photograph of the Clavies doing the work. It wasn't that far of a stretch to believe it could have happened, as his father, Bill Veeck Sr., was the president of the Cubs at the time, and even if there is some reasonable doubt he didn't do the planting himself, it's entirely possible he suggested it to Mr. Wrigley. That was the beginning for Veeck the Jr., as he landed a job as treasurer with the Cubs when his father died and eventually moved up the ladder within different organizations. He eventually became co-owner of the AAA Brewers in 1940 and rattled off 3 titles in 5 years. According to Bill, once again in his autobiography of Veeck as in Wreck, there was a movable fence in the outfield that he could manipulate based on what he thought would be the most beneficial to the Brewers that day, based off of the opposing team's power capabilities. That actually wasn't illegal at the time, but it kind of becomes so when you start moving the ball within a game based on which team is at bat, another thing he claimed to do. Whatever the case, Veeck found instant success in ownership, and he probably would have been able to do it even without the on-field success. Sabre.org describes Veeck as a one-man carnival, and Milwaukee became the place he started testing out his funnel cakes. Well, actually, that would have been more normal. You're likely familiar with the concept of ballpark promotion, but have you ever gone to the ballpark and come home with a live lobster? For whatever reason, Veeck was obsessed with giving away live animals, whether it be the aforementioned lobster, chickens, guinea pigs, or one time he even gave away a horse to a lucky winner. The eccentricities didn't stop there. He realized that overnight workers at war plants didn't get an opportunity to see games, so on occasion he'd schedule morning games to hit them up on their way home and serve all attendees cornflakes for breakfast. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only impact World War II had on him. He'd go off to fight, and his leg would be crushed by a piece of artillery, eventually resulting in a wooden leg. As one does, he reportedly carved holes in it and used it as an ashtray. Having mastered AAA, he tried to buy the Phillies in 1942. He didn't want to do something as boring as just buying another organization, however. He decided that baseball had been segregated for long enough, and he announced his intentions to staff the team entirely with Negro League talent. He thought he had my favorite commissioner, at least on the merits of his name, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, by the nuts. African Americans were overseas fighting in the war for the Allies, so who would dare deny them membership in the major leagues of baseball? According to Veeck, he phoned his intentions over to the commish when he was on his way to Philly for the purchase, and by the time he got there, he was surprised to find out that the National League had taken control of the Phillies, meaning they were no longer for sale. Even if that didn't work, he still did his part in tearing down the color barrier. By 1946, he had sold his share of the Brewers and bought into the Cleveland Indians, and signed the first black player in the American League some 3 months after Jackie Robinson made his debut. The man's name was Larry Doby, and he was introduced to the squad player by player by manager Lou Boudreau, shaking each guy's hand after the introduction. 3 players refused to shake Doby's hand, and it's reported that Veeck had them fired as soon as he could. He also hired Satchel Paige, a Negro League legend who pitched far better than anyone should over the age of 40. He also got back to viewing walls as non-stationary objects, installing a center field wall that could move as much as 15 feet between games, which Veeck took full advantage of whenever a hard-hitting club came into town. Again, this was perfectly legal, or at least it was until the next year when a rule was put in place that a ballpark's dimensions had to stay static throughout a single season. He also got right back into the promotion antics, raffling off Cadillacs one night, giving away nylons the next, which was a wartime rarity. He went beyond giveaways and hired a clown as a coach for a night. That man was Max Padkin. This is him. Yeah, my brain can't really comprehend what's happening here. It's like Ernest meets Drunken Master. It actually reminds me a lot of a night where Hamish and I went out on a bender in Scotland, only Hamish was nowhere near this coordinated, and there were far more sheep involved. Veeck seems like an easy guy to love, right? And if the craziness wasn't enough to win you over, he brought a World Series home to Cleveland in 1948, which is the last time that city ever experienced that. Unfortunately, his wife Eleanor wasn't under the spell and filed for divorce, winning a sizable chunk of Veeck's money. Most of his money, however, was wrapped up in the ball club, so he ended up selling his stake in the Indians, and that was the end of ball club number 2. He remarried and moved on to club number 3, the St. Louis Browns. We just went over them a bit in our last video that set up our franchise World Cup, but for those that didn't see it, at this point in history, St. Louis had two ball clubs. The Cardinals had moved out of their home park of Robinson Field after it pretty much fell apart, as it was one of the last stadiums built completely out of wood. It being St. Louis, it was still nicer than most buildings, so I don't know, something about beggars and choosers. But anyhow, the Browns allowed the Cardinals to share their home in Sportsman's Park beginning in 1920. This was still the case when Veeck got to town in 1951. Maybe it was his roots with the Cubs, but he made it his mission to kill the Cardinals, which is a tall task, as that club was by far the more popular of the two at the time. So, step 1. Hired Cardinals legends to work for the Browns. Rogers Hornsby and Marty Marion became managers, while Dizzy Dean manned the microphone announcing. Step 2, on with the insanity. The publicity stunts to this point had already set a pretty high or low bar, I guess, depending on your point of view. But Veeck sought to outdo himself, and that brings us to our little friend. His name was Eddie Goodell, and the St. Louis faithful got their first look at him as he burst out of a cake that was being used to celebrate the club's 50th anniversary. Seemed like kind of a lackluster move by Veeck, but then the second game of the doubleheader hit. All 3 foot 7 inches and 60 pounds of Eddie Goodell sauntered up to the plate in first inning pinch hitting duty. Naturally, Eddie Hurley, the umpire for the game, who was a notorious stickler for the rules and a frequent ejector of players, turned to the Browns bench and uttered what I imagine amounted to the f***. Anticipating this, Veeck, with a huge grin on his face, came strutting out of the dugout and proudly presented Goodell's contract to the umpire. He had filed it late in the day 2 days prior and was confident it would hold up under scrutiny. He also had a copy of the Browns' active roster on hand and lineup card showing that, yes, in fact, this little dude was on the squad. So, nothing to do but let him bat. The surprise was so robust that not even the Browns players knew what was in the works. Now, Goodell was told under no circumstances would he be allowed to swing. Veeck told him that he had taken out $1 million life insurance policy on his head and would be watching from the shadows with a rifle, ready to shoot Goodell if he even looked tempted to take a cut at the ball. Could be a joke, but always best to err on the side of safety when you're dealing with a man that's already given away a horse to a random fan. Goodell was fine going along with the plan. He had practiced his approach with Veeck earlier, crouching into the most compact batting stance possible, shrinking his strike zone to what Veeck measured to be 1.5 inches. Both the Tigers catcher and pitcher laughed as they realized that this was actually a thing they'd have to participate in, and Bob Swift, the catcher, yelled out some advice to his pitcher. Keep it low. Bob Kane, the pitcher, could not comply and despite his best efforts, walked our tiny hero on 4 pitches, and he received a standing ovation from the Browns faithful. He stopped twice on his trot to first base to bow to the fans before being removed for a pinch runner. He slapped his substitute on the tuchus, retreated back to the dugout, and ended his brief baseball career. But it was technically a career with a legitimate stat, and hence Baseball Reference had no choice to make the man a page. The major leagues voided Eddie's contract the next day as they berated Veeck for making a mockery of the game, to which Veeck responded, "How sure are you that Yankees legend Phil Rizzuto isn't just a really tall dwarf?" As the man stood 5'6". Eddie would continue to work for Veeck, once disguised as an alien during Veeck's stint with the White Sox, and once as a food vendor along several other little people as fans had been complaining about the sight line to the game when the vendors walked by. Sadly, he had a relatively short life, but that's made his autograph the thing of legends, selling at an auction for nearly $7,000. Not long after, the Browns found themselves on a 4-game losing streak. Veeck decided it might be time for a change in strategy. In what must have been a dream for armchair quarterbacks in the greater St. Louis area, Veeck introduced Grandstand Manager Day, where a section of fans were able to vote on the team's actions while the manager sat off to the side in a rocking chair, puffing on a pipe. It's worth noting that this is the year the club would finish 52 and 102, so it's not as if the club's run-of-the-mill managerial decisions were working anyhow. Funnily enough, they won this game 5-3. Being the less popular of the two teams, the Browns' only route to relevancy was to remove themselves from the Cardinals' shadow. Veeck actually got so close to killing the Cardinals he could taste it. The Cardinals' owner was convicted of tax evasion, which meant he'd have to sell the club. It looked like they might be leaving town as the initial interested parties were all from outside the city. But not content with just making shitty beer, Anheuser-Busch stepped up to the plate and kept the cards in the city, and the money they had at their disposal pretty much guaranteed that the Browns were done. The club was allowed to move to Baltimore and became the Orioles, but the catch was Veeck needed to get out of the ownership picture. Apparently, other owners didn't appreciate the never-ending carnival ride that was Bill. Despite being blackballed by owners, he was able to briefly sneak back into baseball by grabbing a piece of the White Sox while the Comiskey's fought amongst themselves. His initial run only lasted from 1959 to 1961, but in that short span, the club won its first pennant in 40 years and introduced the first exploding scoreboard in MLB history, which can still be experienced at the Sox's current-day stadium, although Veeck's variation was a little different. In addition to the fireworks that shot out when a home run was hit, it would also play a variety of noises, including the cavalry charging, a woman screaming for firemen to save her baby, and 2 trains crashing head-on. Opposing teams hated the contraption, and at one point, in a deliciously petty move, Mickey Mantle hit a home run for the visiting Yankees while his teammates paraded in front of the White Sox dugout with sparklers. Other promotions included the Lucky Chair, where various fans won 1,000 cans of beer, 1,000 pies, 1,000 cupcakes. You get the idea. When asked why he didn't give 1,000 fans one beer or a cupcake apiece, his response that, you give 1,000 people a can of beer and each of them will drink it, smack his lips, and go back to watching the game. You give 1,000 cans to one guy, and there's always the outside possibility that 50,000 people will talk about it. He also started the trend of putting players' names on the back of their jerseys. Not bad for a 3-year stint. It was his health that made him turn away from baseball for a period, but many in the owner establishment were happy to see him go. It was during this break that he would write his aforementioned autobiography and other books, which, among other things, insulted the baseball owner establishment. He also used the time to be the only owner to support Curt Flood, who was trying to combat the reserve clause, which essentially allowed teams to do whatever they wanted with their players as they owned them for the entirety of their careers. So, he wasn't making friends. But he closed his book with a warning that sometime, somewhere, there will be a club that no one wants, and old will come wandering around to laugh some more. His prophecy would come true, and this time his antics would turn a baseball field into a war zone. But before we get into the conclusion of Old Will's story, we have another installment of channels with more subscribers than us. Today's channel is Benjamin Bennett, whose bread and butter appears to be sitting in a corner and smiling at a camera for 4 hours. Oh, and he's done this at least 322 times. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of appreciate the dedication, but fear for anyone watching these in their entirety. For his efforts, he's racked up 376,000 subscribers to my 460. Don't let the Dugs disappear into this really weird shadow. If you're enjoying what you're watching today, please consider getting yourself a free subscription to the channel, dropping a like on the video, or letting us what you want to see by leaving us some comments, as all 3 of those actions are really going to help the Dugs take off. Alright, back to our story. The club that nobody wanted turned out to be once again the White Sox, 14 years after he had left the team the first time. The Sox were on the verge of being sent to Seattle, but Veeck threw in his hat to keep the team in the city. As you can imagine, the owners very much didn't want him back in baseball, and they came up with excuse after excuse to keep him out. He outmaneuvered each of these excuses and eventually wore them down. The Tigers owner was quoted to say, "Look, I don't like it any more than you do that we're allowing this guy in here who's called me a son of a bitch over and over, but gentlemen, we've got to take another vote." The vote finally passed to let him back in, and he wasted zero time in once again kicking the carnival back into full gear. In his first day back to work, he posted a sign that said "Open for Business" in the lobby of the hotel that was hosting the winter meetings, and his general manager started wheeling and dealing in plain sight of anyone that cared to watch. In the end, it seemed that Veeck had shot himself in his own foot, or peg. He had argued on the side of Curt Flood when it came to the reserve clause because it was the right thing to do, but when the clause was actually dissolved, he pretty much knew he was done as an owner. The clause's death ushered in the era of free agency and snowballing salaries, which Veeck would not be able to keep up with. So, he decided he was going to make the most of his final ride, however long he might have. The shenanigans this time around included a bicentennial parade where he made good use of his wooden leg, reenacting a scene from the Revolutionary War, belly dancers, horses, cows, introducing shorts as a uniform option, and it even made a Bermuda short night once for the players. He signed Minnie Minoso at the age of 53 to serve as the DH so that he could say he played in 4 different decades. He'd do it again in 1980 so Minnie could claim 5. Harry Caray was also on the south side at this stage, a fact that I fully intend to attempt to erase from my brain with copious amounts of bourbon right after I finish editing this video. Now, there's a few different versions of this story, so I'm going to tell my favorite, and to be fair, it's actually the version that Harry Caray was quoted on, although Harry was known to say a lot of things.
Harry Caray and Steve Stone, I'm chewing on a piece of chocolate cake.
So one day, Bill Veeck is hanging out by the broadcasters, and "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" starts playing over the intercom, and he notices that Harry is mumbling the words to the tune. To hear Harry tell it, it was the only song in the world he knew the words to, so he sang it. That planted a seed for Veeck. The next night, he hid a public address microphone near Harry, and around the second verse, Harry realizes his voice is booming back at him from the stadium, accompanied by the collective voice of over 1,000 fans. After the incident, Harry went up to Bill and asked him what the hell was that all about. Bill's response was simply, "Harry, I've been looking for 45 years for the right man, and the first time I heard you, I knew you were the right man. So Caray's feeling pretty good about himself at this point, but Bill makes the classic mistake of not stopping while you're ahead and follows up with, "I knew as soon as I heard you that the fans in the bleachers and the fans in the luxury boxes knew that they could sing better than you. If you had a good singing voice, you would intimidate them and nobody would join in." Whatever the case, Harry singing in the stretch was born that day, and he carried the song to the north side when he began working for the Cubs, where it's become a legendary tradition continued to this day, even though Harry Caray has been dead since 1998. Even though the timing doesn't line up perfectly, the last story is all about Veeck going out with a giant, ill-advised bang. If we're being fair, it technically wasn't Bill Veeck's fault, as he handed the reins of promotions director over to his son Mike Veeck at this point, and it's unclear how much Bill's influence factored into Disco Demolition Night. There was also a co-conspirator in Steve Dahl, who was a Chicago radio personality. Steve was fired from his previous station when they decided to become an all-disco, all-the-time station in 1978. They did this to him on Christmas Eve. Suffice it to say, Steve Dahl hated disco, and he wasn't alone. There was a clear divide between rock and disco that went a lot further than just the music preference. It was a classic example of an excuse for some to demonstrate hatred towards people that were very, very much unlike them. The Sox were terrible in 1979 and were already 11 games out of first in July and averaging only about 15,000 fans per game. Mike Veeck clearly didn't fall from his father's tree, as he was looking for any opportunity to bolster the attention for the lackluster club. He took notice of the reaction Steve Dahl's diatribe against disco was getting, though maybe he should have taken notice that it wasn't all fun and games. Dahl claimed that his followers, who he called the insane coho lips, were locked in a war, quote, dedicated to the eradication of the dreaded musical disease known as disco. And if Veeck didn't see any red flags there, maybe he should have saw a few spring up, when Dahl's response to the death of the artist behind the hustle was bringing one of his albums to the studio and snapping it in half. Or if that didn't do it, perhaps an incident earlier in the year in Seattle, when hundreds of rock fans attacked a mobile dance floor in protest of disco, should have been a clue that this had turned into a full-out culture war. Whatever the case, Mike Veeck didn't see it and wanted to cash in on the passion that surrounded this war in music. So he partnered with Steve Dahl, who had been rehired at this point by a rock station, and they came up with the idea of Disco Demolition Night. Fans were to bring their disco albums they wanted destroyed to the park, receiving admission for under $1 if they participated. Those records were to be placed in a giant crate, and between the two games of a doubleheader, they were to be exploded. The Sox were expecting a 4,000, maybe 5,000 person boost in their attendance, which, compared to the prior night, would have them weighing in at around 20K. Mike Veeck, the son, hired enough security to handle 35,000. Bill Veeck, the father, had a really bad feeling about this thing and checked him out of the hospital where he was undergoing tests. The profanity-laden signs he saw on the way to the ballpark did nothing to reassure him. The official attendance for the double bill was just short of 48,000, with another 20,000 wanting to attend but stranded outside the park. Only they didn't want to be stranded outside the park. So they started climbing over the stadium's turnstiles, trying to break through windows or whatever it took to get in. So security that could handle 13,000 fewer people than what had shown up, and in reality it was probably 15 to 16K fewer people when you count the outsiders that forced their way into the stadium, security was in a bit of a pickle. Many of them were diverted to guard the outside of the stadium to try to keep people from storming the gates. This left the inside of the field lightly guarded, and the fans took notice. Those who had not turned in all of their records would occasionally hurl them like deadly frisbees onto the field during the first game, along with lighters, empty liquor bottles, and firecrackers. Still, the Sox managed to get through the first half of what was apparently a night-night doubleheader, and Dahl took to the field a bit after 8 for the festivities. He circled the park in a Jeep, which, when combined with the military gear he was wearing, did nothing to dispel the violent atmosphere that had started to develop. Reasonable fans who were getting a sense that something bad was about to happen had a tough time leaving the stadium, as all but one gate was padlocked in order to keep the outside vandals from breaking in. As promised, Dahl exploded the crate of records, and herein lies the first problem. You've got an entire additional game of baseball to play, and now, due to the magnitude of the explosion, you've got a small crater in the middle of center field. The second problem was that fans began to take notice of the light security in the park and took it upon themselves to slide down the foul poles and enter the field to play. I present to you an incomplete list of damages. Bases and bats were stolen, home plate was dug up, grass was torn up, the batting cages were destroyed, and fun fact, at one point, Michael Clark Duncan, no shit, took the field, slid into third, and went home with a souvenir baseball bat. Harry Caray came over the PA trying to settle the rioters down, no dice. The scoreboard implored people to return to their seats, no dice. Bill Veeck, who had reached the game at this point, began to sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" in an attempt to divert attention, Nothing doing. It took police in riot gear to finally end the chaos, and by the time the grounds crew had done their best to clean up the debris, it was well past 10 p.m. And maybe the funniest argument made in this entire video, Bill Veeck attempted to convince baseball authorities that the second game should be played, but the Tigers argued against the request on account of, the small center field crater, home plate not quite fitting back into the ground right, and the possibility of little melted shards of vinyl littering the field. The Tigers won the argument, and the Sox were forced to forfeit the game. Mike Veeck, the son, clearly learned his lesson and could be found offering a promotion that involved destroying Justin Bieber and Miley Cyrus merchandise in 2014 at a minor league game involving the club he was a president of. If Bill Veeck wasn't blackballed already, he certainly was after this incident, but as we mentioned, it was kind of over already when the era of free agency guaranteed he didn't have the means to put together a serious contender. He's a divisive figure. You couldn't argue with the fact that he sold tickets, but some thought it was at the expense of making a mockery of the game and sacrificing the quality of his team. Then again, he destroyed the competition with Milwaukee, won the Indians' last World Series, and even made a run at it with the Sox in the free agent era, going for 90 wins in 1977. There are many owners who have done a lot less with a lot more. And so that does it for us. Once again, comments, likes, and subscriptions would be huge for us and are the most surefire way to make us a thing. Next time you see us, we'll be kicking off the Franchise Cup, so if you missed our group stage draw, make sure to give this video a click and check it out. Or, if you like the insanity of this video, check out what I think is probably our craziest story in how a Yankee took on an ostrich in a pasta eating contest. As always, I've been Johnny Paprika. Hoping all of your balls are fair and all of your wood is good. Good night, everybody!